10 months of killing and destruction in Ukraine, and with it all the shattering of a core European belief that no major land war would ever again be fought on the continent. Crucially, though, Europe had underestimated Vladimir Putin.
My fear is that it does seem that Putin is ready, as I said, to take Russia, Ukraine, and everybody else down with him. Is the West, is the United States ready for that?
He put himself in a situation where he has no good exits, and I think this blackmail and threats is the only instrument he may use to try to get himself out of this.
He will seek to apply maximum force, and if nuclear is part of that arsenal, and he feels that which it is, and he feels it's going to give him an advantage, I've no doubt that we should be prepared for him to use it.
The risk of letting President Putin win is much higher than to continue to support Ukraine as we do.
Throughout the year, we've charted the progress of this war as seen by very different observers: Ukrainian, Russian, European, and American. Now, in this special programme, we look at the gap between what was said and what happened, and try to assess how the conflict might develop in the months ahead. But let's start back in February, in a freezing East European winter, with tens of thousands of Russian troops camped a step away from Ukraine. On the morning of the 24th, they moved, a seismic shock to the whole construct of European security. It had begun not with a single lie, but with a blizzard of false denials and accusations of Western hysteria. Even as their forces had massed along Ukraine's border, Kremlin diplomats and observers had assured the world Moscow threatened no one. War was out of the question.
In my opinion, it's totally unlikely because it's not on the Russian agenda. But this is a high-stake game. And I'm absolutely sure that Mr. Putin, as we know him, when we know him for pretty many years already, he's not a gambler.
Not a gambler, but what kind of information was Putin receiving? According to Russian insiders, civil servants at all levels of government simply told their bosses what they wanted to hear, whether it was true or not.
I think on the very low level, people who work really in the field, so to speak, they know the truth. But while the truth is being reported from down to up, it is distorted in many ways. So it's no surprise that the decision makers on the upper end of the chain, they have the information which is not reflecting reality in full.
In Russia now, you can't say anything except what the Kremlin tells you or the Ministry of Defense tells you. So what kind of prestige that is? They can make up any story. And really, at this point in time, I mean, you covered the Soviet Union and then Russia. They always lied, but now they're just lying through their teeth at all times.
The Ukrainians were quick to call for Western support, sanctions and tough action against Russia, and supplies of weapons to fight back against a much larger army. The fact that many were predicting a quick Russian victory seemed only to strengthen the Ukrainians' resolve. They adapted to war as part of their daily life.
I've learned to live with it personally, and so have millions of Ukrainians who remained in Ukraine. It's a strange feeling that you know that it can all end tomorrow, but I think the fear of losing freedom and losing life in a free Ukraine, losing the home, is greater than the fear of losing your own life.
As Moscow's advance ground to a halt on several fronts, the Russians raised the temperature with talk of their nuclear weapons, and the world sat up and took notice. Was Putin bluffing, or could this be the beginning of World War III?
Yes, we take it seriously. We take it seriously now because look, he may not have any other battlefield instruments to withstand the Ukrainian counter-advances. So I think Ukraine is taking this seriously, and the international community has to take it seriously.
You said what disturbed you most in the Russian embassy was the casual way some of your fellow diplomats talked about nuclear strikes against the West, even though they worked in arms control. Did they have no idea how these nuclear strikes that they were talking about might lead to World War III or the consequences of that?
This very dangerous thing is that those people who are boasting about this possibility to make nuclear strikes against the West, against the United States in the first place, those people are sure that there will be no retaliation, that the West will just swallow it and just bend their knees and let's say, okay, we're scared. Okay, let's make peace negotiations.
I think that this nuclear rhetoric and the threats we have seen from Russia, the aim is, of course, to coerce us, to blackmail us, to stop providing support to Ukraine. But if we do that, then President Putin will win in Ukraine. And if he wins in Ukraine, that will send a very dangerous message to all authoritarian leaders that when they use military force in a brutal way, violate international law, they will achieve their goals.
So while the fighting was in Ukraine, NATO painted the conflict as a battle on everyone's turf for freedom, democracy and the rule of law. But was the alliance at all prepared for a fight on that scale?
I mean, the so what out of all this is effective deterrence. And I cannot stress more strongly the need for NATO to gear itself up, to mobilize, to be prepared, ultimately, to fight a war of national survival. And that means armed forces on a scale we have not seen since the most tense days of the Cold War, with really significant forces capable and able to operate. And that's going to mean rearmament, it's going to mean reconstitution of forces, it's going to mean it's going to have implications on our societies in a way which we haven't seen for generations.
I think President Putin has given NATO a new lease of life. After the era of expeditionary warfare, some people in the alliance were wondering whether it's still relevant. We've been warning our Western allies all along that Russia's state ideology, Russia's security services, and Russia's exercises point to a new imperialism. And unfortunately, we've been vindicated. It took NATO some years to write contingency plans for Central Europe, then some minimal physical presence. But this physical presence is now increasing.
It may be increasing, but in Hungary, another NATO member, the government has been testing the alliance's unity, refusing to send weapons to Ukraine or allow them to be shipped through its territory. Is Budapest a weak link in NATO's chain? NATO wants Zelensky to win the war. Your Prime Minister calls him an opponent. NATO sends more and more weapons. You say that's just prolonging the war. Do you want Zelensky to win the war?
We want peace.
You don't want him to win?
Whatever it takes and however it's achieved.
Even if it's peace at Moscow's price?
Whatever happens in Ukraine is no good, not only for Hungary, but for Europe.
And what about the Russian people? Hard to know what their views really are. Harder still to know if the Kremlin takes any notice of them.
They don't want to think about it. There are so many people even texting me on my Telegram, in the comments on my Telegram channel saying, we don't want to know. Why are you keep telling us that we are committing crimes in Ukraine? We don't want to know it because it's too difficult. It's not easy. And also there is a problem of internal relationships in the families in Russia. People are fighting each other. They are having divorces. They're having terrible conflicts with the friends, with relatives, husbands and wives and brothers. I mean, this is something that is really unacceptable for millions of Russians.
So while Russians argue amongst themselves, the political opposition has been decimated. Its leaders largely in jail or they've fled the country. If there is a threat to Putin's leadership, it won't be from any of them. Whatever happens with Putin, there's no sign of any liberal faction waiting in the wings to take over, is there? None whatsoever.
No, absolutely. It doesn't exist. And to be honest, even the hope that says Russian oligarchs now might be, well, rebel just because they've put under the sanctions. Well, it's not a really option here. These people, because they lost their contracts with the West some years ago, and they were given help by the government by military contracts. Now, many of them became part of the Russian military-industrial complex, and that makes them even more dependent on the Kremlin and Putin.
But has Putin's grip on power already weakened? His army has underperformed beyond all expectations. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers are reported to have been killed. What cards does he have left to play?
To be honest, I do not quite understand how Putin can get out of this without claiming some sort of victory. He needs that. He needs to provide some victory to the Russians and to the world, because it's all about his standing. And but to be honest, I don't quite see what it might be, because even if, say, he has some sort of agreement with Zelensky, the sanctions are still there, the economy is ruined, and for what?
Can Putin, in the long term, survive this, do you think?
I don't think so.
Since Soldatov spoke, Moscow has fared badly on the battlefield. The lavish Kremlin celebrations of annexation proved absurdly premature and humiliating. The Kherson region, claimed by Putin as Russian forever, was retaken by Ukraine shortly afterwards. Western military experts see good prospects for President Zelensky in the months ahead.
It looks to me that Ukraine has achieved irreversible momentum, that there is no way that Russia can turn that back. And even President Zelensky had said, I don't need troops, I need the tools, the equipment, the ammunition, and so on. And so I think that the path we're on now, as long as the West sticks together and delivers everything that we said we're going to deliver and keep the sanctions in place, this does not have to go to a conflict involving NATO directly versus Russia. But the key will be all of us sticking together. My assessment is that Ukraine will have liberated Crimea by the end of summer, by August of 2023.
General Hodges may well be right, but if Putin loses this war, could he be just as dangerous as if he'd won it? Either way, no one seems to believe that the world will go back to the way it was just a year ago.
I can't imagine that it would be business as usual, within a few weeks or months after the conclusion of this conflict. There will always be a Russian state. Of course there will, and there should always be a Russian state. And we will need to work with them for all the big issues that are important to us now. But I think the emphasis needs to be on protecting the international rules-based order, which includes respect for boundaries, respect for international law, respect for human rights.
Yeah, I am sure that after this Ukrainian war crisis will be over, the world will be totally different. And all the previous approaches, all the previous conceptions of mutual deterrence, of the balance, will not work anymore. And I can agree with you that it's a very dangerous development of the situation, because the existence of nuclear arsenal will be not anymore both psychological and military barrier.
On the battlefields of Ukraine, both sides are fighting the winter. The Russians targeting Ukraine's energy installations in the hope of increasing people's suffering and destroying their morale. Ukraine is clear that it wants nothing less than victory and the return of all occupied land. But the West is far less clear and far less united about what a victory should mean. And while that uncertainty persists, the fate of Europe and the security of millions of its people will continue to hang in the balance.